So, at the time of recording this, Wendigoon released his Petscop video around 3 days ago, and I just wanted to go over two major issues I had with his explanation towards the end of the video. Now, number one on that list is that Wendigoon says that, I suppose because of his voice, that Paul sounds quite young, too young to have a child. Now, this is kind of irrelevant at the end of the day, because Paul doesn't have a child. However, we do know, and Wendigoon agrees with this, that Hare and Paul share a birthday. And if, under Wendigoon's logic, Hare is the twin sibling of Paul, Paul would have to have been born on November 12th, 1992. Now, Wendigoon also states, at a different point in the video, that he thinks that Paul is playing the game in 2017. This would put Paul at the age of 24 to 25, which is perfectly old enough to have a child. So now, I just wanted to point out that little logical inconsistency first, because it's not really important to the plot of Petscop itself, but it did irk me a little bit because it's a very obvious little inconsistency there that was left out. Now, the second thing I'd like to tackle is Wendigoon's ending theory that both Paul is Lena's son from either birth or very close to it, and that Paul and Hare are twin siblings. Now, I personally subscribe to the theory, as I know many fans of Petscop do, that in some way or another, it changes depending on who you ask. It could be a million different ways. Paul and Hare are the same person. Whether or not literally the same person, metaphorically, through alternate timelines, one was rebirthed into the other. In one way or another, they are the same person. Now, the biggest reason I say Wendigoon's explanation in specific is wrong is because Wendigoon states that Paul and Hare are essentially twin siblings who were, assumedly because Paul obviously does not remember Hare, separated very early on in life or at birth. Now, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense because even if they were very close as children, Paul and Hare seemingly share a lot of memories that only Hare would really have from their childhood, or, at least notably disturbed by things that Hare would recognize or Hare would be traumatized by, when any regular person that wasn't involved at all would not. Now, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if Paul and Hare were separated young and raised by two separate people, I figure the distance between them would have been good enough to prevent shared memories and/or experiences, especially considering Paul has no recollection of Hare, yet does remember these other aspects. Further, while Paul does admit that he has a very strong resemblance to Hare, he seems to, at least in my opinion, have an aversion to being seen or known as a girl. For instance, in Petscop 15, his in-game character attempts to keep moving away from the picture of the girl in the school building. And in Petscop 17, Raynor's dialogue seems to pretty conclusively hammer home to Paul that he is a girl named Carrie Mark, trying to get him to realize that this is who he was in the past, I believe. Even if Paul doesn't want to hear any of it. They were the same person, and there's some kind of rebirthing or memory loss that has gone on here. Now, as for how Paul and Hare are the same person, and why Paul's first and last name both change from Carrie Mark, there are dozens of theories, whether it was rebirthing, whether Paul is the real person and Hare never existed at all, whether metaphorical names are being used, etc. There's people that say that Paul is a trans man and he doesn't remember that he was once Hare. Personally, my belief is that Paul was essentially born Paul. However, his father wanted him so badly to be a girl because he wanted him to grow up to be Lena that he named him Carrie Mark and tried to raise him as a girl in his early childhood. Now, throughout the story, Paul does not exactly have the best recollection of his own past, and therefore, I think it's likely that if Paul was Hare at the age of 5 years old and below, he might not remember that part of his life, especially if it was shrouded in a lot of traumas. So simply put, Marvin tried to raise his son, Paul, as a girl named Hare. Now, assuming that when Hare returned home, they were essentially hidden from Marvin, it would logically follow that they may have sent Paul to live with his aunt. and they changed his name to be her last name and to have a male first name because they're not trying to raise him as a girl anymore because Marvin doesn't have control anymore. So they changed his name to Paul Leskowitz. And that explains the adoption, that explains why his last name is Leskowitz, that explains why Paul and Care are so similar as to almost be the same person. And it also evades any lingering questions of, say, Paul being a trans man. Because personally, I think if Paul was a trans man, he would remember that bit about himself at least. He's still in the same body. And Paul being a bright guy, as you can tell, he figures out stuff before the viewer does most of the time in Petscop. He would put 2 and 2 together relatively quickly, seeing the shared birthday and everything. Oh, wait a minute, I was born female. This is a girl with the same birthday as me in this story. I've never heard of her before. I exist nowhere in this story. That's another thing. Paul is entirely absent in the past timeline, and Care is entirely absent in the future timeline, which, again, is pretty strong evidence to me that they are the same person. So that's my short little video debunking a few things that Wendigoon put in his video that I personally don't agree with, being my own personal take on things, which I personally believe to be way more likely than what Wendigoon represents in his video. So thank you for watching, and see you next time.